Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about game development methodologies and potentially best practices with how to structure and execute development. We'll cover topics such as team structure, typical game dev phases, key engineering processes, and finally, best practices and tools. And with us today to speak on these topics, I feel very fortunate to have some industry heavyweights with us here today, including first, Chris Cobb, co-founder and CTO of Pragma Platform, who also formerly worked as an engineering lead at Riot Games and held software development roles at both Popcap and Microsoft. Next, we have Noemi Rouleau, I think that's how you pronounce your last name, who is an associate producer at Square Enix Montreal, but who also worked in production at Ubisoft on games like RainbowSix Siege, For Honor, and Assassin's Creed Origins. And finally, we have Xiang Shen, who is CTO at Century Games, the Beijing-based games developer and publisher, and who also formerly founded mobile game studio Outact and was formerly a technical director at Roblox and worked in software engineering at Tencent, EA, and Ubisoft. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
So kind of just jumping right in, I thought we could first talk about basically development teams in terms of structure, roles, and responsibilities. And I know, for example, Noemi, you used to work more on the console side and now kind of shifting into mobile. But in terms of like the different kinds of team structures and roles that you guys are seeing, can you speak to like the different things that you're seeing and maybe what can be more appropriate in certain environments relative to others? And maybe if you do want to start, Noemi?
Sure. First of all, I was quite surprised actually when I started on mobile at Square Enix that there is a lot of stuff that's actually the same. It's very similar, right? For team structure, we're still making games, so there's a lot of things like on the day-to-day that's the same. I feel for me, what changes the most, like a team structure, is the type of games you're making. So, for example, if you're making like a AAA traditional game, or I would assume if you're making like a mobile premium game as well, your team structure is going to be fairly the same, right? It's like you work on a product, no one sees it, and then you launch. But if you work on a gas game, I think that's where you have a lot of difference in your structure because you're not going to need the same expertise. You're not necessarily going to have the focus on the same team. So I feel like that's where you see a lot of the difference more on the type of games you make.
Right. And maybe even within mobile, I would say like we're seeing kind of a couple of different structures, right? Like, so for example, for some high production games, like some of the bigger studios like EA, we see like these huge teams, well, huge in a relative sense, where you might see teams that are between, let's say, 30 to 100 versus a smaller, more compact, more Supercell style team, which might be 10 or less, or, like between 10 to 15, for example. And so maybe Chris, do you want to can you speak in terms of like some of the different kinds of like maybe team sizes that you've seen and maybe, I don't know, specific kinds of role differences that you've seen as well?
Yeah, I think when you start breaking down like, who you need on a team, it's going to definitely depend on the genre you're working in, like Noemi said. I think that oftentimes when you talk about the team scale, there's two main vectors that I would say you're going to have to think about, which is one, how you manage a team. It definitely has to change based on your team size.
Yeah.
Because when you're small and light, you can just kind of work around a whiteboard and keep a to-do list. Whereas if you're managing a team of 20 to 100, suddenly you need formal processes and check-ins, and you have teams that depend on one another. In terms of the kind of people you need, I think that one factor beyond the genre that changes how many people you need is the difference between content development versus like systems. So if you're trying to work with a smaller team and you're building a kind of recurring scheduled event-based systems, you can oftentimes invest a smaller number of people in making something that is going to, go on a cycle, right? Like a seasonal or a battle pass kind of thing. If you're going for high volume content where you have to produce tons and tons of new art, new animations, new gameplay elements, that's when your team size starts to really expand. Definitely on the like production and art side, but it will also increase, the size of the engineering team you'd need.
Right. And Xiang, I know that in China, what we've been kind of seeing are some of these like mega teams, like, with companies like whether it's Tencent Timmy, or I even heard Wild Rift had what, 450 for a mobile game. But can you speak to some of those issues and like even for some of these teams that we're seeing in China, like these huge teams, what maybe you could speak to some of your experience there.
Yeah. It's I don't think that's a China only scenario. It's only basically if you want to make AAA games, you need a huge team. For example, in China, example is Genshin Impact. They, as far as I know, they have over 600 developers on this single game before they launched the game. So they probably have more today. I don't know. But I used to work for AAA games when I was at EA and Ubisoft. I remember the largest team I worked with was Madden and NFL. Even it's a serious game. I think the team size, exclude the central tech team, it's already over 100. I can't remember for sure, but something like that. At Tencent, we used to make MMORPG. That's also a AAA quality game. So that's the team size is close to 100, probably 80. But when you start to move to a smaller mobile-based game, you see the team size drastically decline, and particularly at different phases. And when you are at early stage, you don't want a large team to work on the concept. You're gonna actually hurt your development. You can't be agile. We can talk about that later. I'm sure it can be on the topic, but. So usually you see a relatively smaller team work on concept, work on iterations, and then when you prove the concept, right? When you plan to go massive development, you grow the team, you hire a contractor, you hire full-time employees. The team size could go larger. I definitely saw a team size over 50 for mobile game development, even if it's not a very complex mobile game, like social game or that type of game, SLG type of game will have large, SLG is a Chinese terminology, it's 4X game. It's have a larger team. It could be close to 100, but you rarely see a mobile team larger than 100 because mobile is relatively lightweight, unless there are some type of mobile game like Kings of Arena, I can't remember, Owner of Arena, whatever, Tencent game.
Honor of Kings?
Honor of Kings, that's right. Yeah. It definitely has a much larger team because they need, they have a very high demand content development. They have the higher standard of that. So it definitely varies of game types and platforms.
Yes, it sounds like if you have heavy content cadence, or maybe the other issue is, I would assume that maybe the reason why Riot's Wild Rift team might be so big is they're trying to speed things up. They're trying to get something out fast.
That's right. It makes sense, right? The size of the game is definitely it requires that. Because they're very sure about what they are going to do. They basically just work on existing IP and make sure it works on the platform. Is definitely going to ship that. They don't worry about any cost or anything like that. They have the AAA experience. That's why they can have a much larger team. But for other smaller team, they really can't handle that kind of size.
I thought that maybe the other aspect of the team structure that we could talk about is with respect to like specific roles. From my perspective, in terms of on the more of the product side, it feels like there's usually like this big difference with respect to like console or formerly console studios relative to mobile studios. And even on the mobile side, there's a difference when we talk about a product manager versus a producer and like what those roles mean or they entail. And then it'd be great, Noemi, if you could speak to maybe some of your experience at Ubisoft and Square Enix in terms of what does it mean to be a producer versus a PM. And then from a technology perspective, it'd be great to hear, when it comes to like the development sprint, like how do you, maybe you could speak in terms of what a typical dev team structure looks like, and then what would be the scope of responsibility for like, an engineering lead and that kind of thing. But Noemi, do you want to start? In your experience, what have you seen with respect to like producers versus PMs and things like that?
Yeah, so like the PM job for me was definitely like a new thing when I joined Square Enix, because I don't know if other AAA have this role, but at when I was at Ubisoft, it's not the role we had. Like this role is filled, but by many different people, if you will.
Yeah.
Even if you have monetization and everything. And like AAA is less maybe KPI driven than mobile, right? There's a big difference there. Yeah. So I saw that took some adjustment for me, like to really well understand the role as well and how it interact with producers and also with the creative team, right? Because I think like the product manager is, it has some things that go with the producers as well, like that overlaps a little bit or that is similar, but I think there's a big creative side as well to it. So I see this role as really in between like a director and a producer a little bit. Again, I don't know if it's like that in all companies, but for us, that's where it sits.
Yeah, and maybe from my own experience, kind of like the sort of patterns that I've seen is, for example, to your point, it does seem that a lot of HD, like PC console companies, this role of PM is relatively new. That you generally have a producer, and like within mobile teams, it does seem like the big difference is really around, and at some mobile game studios, the role of a producer and a PM are different. It does seem that the companies that have more of a console legacy structure, they're usually producer driven, meaning the producers make a lot of the calls with respect to like features, backlog, product vision, things like that. Whereas the more mobile centric companies, it's more PM. And then what we're also seeing is like the interface between a PM and producer to engineering is often different at different gaming companies as well. Whereas when, like at a company like Zynga, a PM may never directly interface with an engineer, and you have a producer instead as that interface. Whereas at other gaming companies that are, especially the ones that are smaller and more full stack, you have the PMs who may be directly interfacing with engineering, overseeing development sprints, running the scrum, things of that nature. But maybe Xiang or Chris, can you talk about your experience? And maybe if you guys also have any thoughts in terms of what you've seen, maybe some thoughts in terms of your preferences or what you think is a better structure for whether it's, on the console side or the mobile side. Maybe starting with you, Chris.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the difficulties with this conversation, I think, is that every studio has its own names. And so it's really tough to standardize what it means.
For sure.
But like if you zoom all the way out, I think that you've got some kind of vision holder, and that's like the person more on the creative side, trying to imagine like what the end experience is going to be for players. Right. And then you've got to have somebody who's helping run teams. And so whether that's the same person or whether, and I think that this gets into the different flavors or styles. So at Riot, we had a formal product manager on a team, but they were purely from the product lens of prioritization. And then we had a separate dev manager, or probably what most people think of as a producer, doing the like running the team scrum. Mm-hmm. But for heavily engineer-oriented teams, then the tech lead was very involved in that process and prioritization too, because there's so many technical decisions that dictate what order you have to build things in. So, I think that when you get down to it, there's like a couple key questions that if you can answer well, I think that it creates a lot of clarity for the team. Yeah. And if you get it muddled, then people can get confused. And part of that is ultimately who is making the decision of what the team is focused on.
Right.
But second, that sometimes doesn't get accounted for is like how much resources you're going to invest in this effort, right? So on the one hand, you say, well, we have to have this thing. It has to exist. But the question is, well, is that a 2-week effort or a 2-month effort? And a lot of that's going to come down to some of the details of how you're going to execute, which means that the engineers need to be involved at least in that conversation. So in general, I just say like when I've seen it go wrong is when it's unclear who gets to make that final decision on what the team works on. But a little bit more subtle is if it gets kind of unclear how much investment the studio is ready to make on a particular feature. And so I think when you're smaller or it's earlier and you're just trying to iterate quickly, you really just have to decide what's the most important thing and how long are we going to spend experimenting. Once you get into that full production cycle, then it has to become a little bit more mechanical and predictable. But at that point, you want to solve some of your big, risks or tech issue areas so that you can actually build a schedule. I think teams that want to try to build a schedule before they've answered enough questions oftentimes are just going to suffer from picking a date and finding out that there's way too much iteration happening for that to be really reliable. So that gets back into those development phases.
And Xiang, what are your thoughts? And maybe if you could describe for a typical, let's say, mobile game engineering team, what would that team kind of look like in terms of roles and number of heads or something like that?
Right, sounds good. Yeah, I was about to say, Chris pretty much summarized what I wanted to say. I actually can speak to aspect, which is a little bit new. One is the culture difference. I think the Western team and Eastern team, they are still quite different, which I wanted to mention a little bit. The other is we can definitely talk about the tech team structure after that. So the first thing is the Eastern team mostly originated from the Japanese video game development. Is basically they are producer driven. So you basically see a producer in the team who is the biggest guy over there and make all the decisions. And the producer is in the Western world executive producer, but in my opinion, it's more than exec producer. It's basically just the owner of this entire product line, entire team, right? It's morale driven and it's everything. So this guy makes all the decisions. His vision is important, and he or her vision is important, and that's it. And this is basically the spirit of this entire team. You mostly see when sometimes they release the game and you see a lot of fans, they want the copy from the signature from the producer. This is culture kind of thing. It's very similar in China, and the producer is number one guy in this entire team. For example, in our company, the producer owns P&L of the game and makes all the decisions. And we do kind of a review with the producer directly. Even the tech review, the producer participating in that most of the time. That person needs to know everything. This is quite different from the Western game development. In the Western, people usually own what they are responsible for. Like the tech director owns the tech, and the art director owns the art, and the producer mostly do the production, things like that. But in Eastern world, it's always the top-down structure, and the producer owns everything, and then the art director and the tech lead, those things like that. So this is the number one thing I wanted to mention. The second is we definitely talk about the tech team. So I think it's structurally pretty similar. I mean, there is not much culture difference, because I used to work with those cross-continent development, and think the easiest thing that we can connect both sides is the tech. So because people speak the same language, and it's much easier, and the structure is easy. Always a tech lead making decisions and doing the infrastructure designs. Tech designs, and then senior people doing kind of a senior work, and junior people work on other stuff. So it's very straightforward for the tech team. So basically, one small difference is, which only when I started working in China, I noticed is most Chinese game development studio, they tend to separate the client team and the server team, and there's always a server team lead and client team lead in the team. So it's not quite the case at least in US when I was working there. We have gameplay programmers, and they work on, they could be full stack, or they could just work on gameplay code. There are some when I was at EA, I was in the online team. So online team that not only work on the server stuff, but also the client stuff that related to the online gameplay. So so that's kind of a little bit different because in my opinion, seems in the Eastern culture, like people tend to make the responsibility, the boundary much clearer. So people will focus on their stuff, which could be a good stuff. But I personally wanted to, in my opinion, like I think a team that they collaborate more usually be more efficient. So I'm personally encouraging team to cross the boundary as much as possible, not just to like focus on your stuff. So that's my opinion.
Got it. And maybe kind of shifting to the next topic, which is really around different phases of game development. I think that at least on the mobile side, there's generally some notion of pre-production, alpha, beta, soft launch, hard launch. But what the objectives are and how, whether it's the team size or the specific objectives of each of those different development phases are different based upon the company. And so I thought we could just kind of talk about how it may differ for each of you. And Noemi, do you want to start in terms of like what you're seeing, whether it's at Square Enix or Ubisoft, or just more generally speaking?
Yeah. I think like what you describe is pretty much also standard for AAA, at least my experience in AAA, right? We have conception before pre-prod as well. Like when your team size is really small, and it's a very waterfall. What I've found so far, at least how we're doing it at Square Enix right now in Montreal, we have some phases that overlap. For example, on our side, we've decided to go live very early. So it means that we're doing production while also being in beta phase in live. So we're really doing like our learning our live ups while also continuing to build the game itself. So that's something that I think slowly like big AAA company or at least like a PC company are doing more and more. But I find it like much easier on mobile, maybe because our teams are smaller as well. And there's like a proper infrastructure as well, like on Google, where you can be on the beta track and stuff like that. So for me, that was a big change. And it also, there's big gains of going live really fast because like you can have real-time feedback and you can really see like, is our infrastructure holding up really well? Or like, do we have to change our matchmaking or network structure or anything? But it also brings like a complexity for the team. And I think we're going to talk about that later. But like, how do we structure the work and how do we make it clear to people what are the priorities and everything? Because we're doing two phases at the same time.
Right. And so to some degree, if I'm hearing you correctly, Noemi, by trying to go live as quickly as possible, what you may be doing is just trying to get as much market feedback as quickly as possible. So to some degree, the way that you structure your pre-production relative to, let's say, your alpha and beta might be a little bit different because because if you do value that market feedback, you may be kind of speeding through those phases. Is that fair to say, or?
I think it's not necessarily speeding through them, but more doing them in parallel.
Okay.
So because, for example, for us, how I would like visualize it is that basically our beta phase is feeding our production phase. Okay. So we still have production go, but because we have constant feedback, because we release fairly often as well to the public. So that means that we can really iterate as soon as we want on things while also working on the more long-term things, which, if you think about it, is not really far from what Gas Game do. For example, what we did on Rainbow, how we worked, is a little bit like that, right? Because you always work on stuff for the future while also maintaining everything that's live and doing your operations and your events and everything. So it's a little bit like that, but to a smaller scale.
Got it. Chris, what about you? How do you think about those different development phases?
Yeah, well, I definitely would say that what Xiang mentioned earlier on about keeping that team size small during that exploratory phase is essential. The ability for a small group of people to experiment and iterate quickly is really important. And we had one R&D team that, ended up kind of, I guess they shut down one experiment and moved people onto new projects, but they were doing a retrospective on like what that looked like and what that meant. And one of the key insights they had was they had grown from 6 people up to I think 20 or 30, and they said that once they got to that size, it was so hard in that earliest exploratory phase to get any consensus, to get any buy-in, because everyone's going to have their own ideas. So I definitely think that there's that key aspect of starting small early on. And then I think that it is a hard transition though, as you go into like pre-prod, because the goal with pre-prod, I would say, is about trying to get the engine of content development or the process of content development built. And that is engineering work to build systems and tools for content developers. But you're still trying to iterate on core systems and feedback. And so if you try to create a pipeline or a system too early, then it makes it harder to continue iterating and adapting. However, if you don't build those tools for yourself, especially if you're pursuing like a games as a service title, that gets really painful later, because maybe you've, kind of manage to produce enough content for your launch day, but if those systems aren't already online by the time you go live, then suddenly that next content release becomes a real struggle. So the balancing act, I think, as Noemi was describing, it's both working on those long-term things and making it easier for the team to work and still trying to produce value. And that is, I feel like it's a nice edge. You have to constantly try to balance. If you overinvest in short-term content, then you might find yourself in a really bad spot where you cannot keep your content pipeline going. On the other hand, if you spend all your time trying to bake these really robust systems, you might find that that system is shaped in a way that doesn't let you iterate on your gameplay features. So I do think that that's the fundamental trade, and it's definitely not an easy one, but it's kind of it's a fun journey too.
Xiang, what do you think?
So yeah, echo on that. I think one thing I was trying to emphasize with my teams are like process, and it's very interesting that we're talking about that right now. Is even the team is small, it should still follow some kind of guideline. You don't just be ad hoc, and you could be kind of agile, but you don't want to be making a mess for the future development. So a few things we want to do is, first, you need to have I think we are going to talk about that later, but I can give a kind of a early sneak peek. It's that you wanted to have some kind of process defined for your future development, and you try to stick with that process, basically. For example, if you want to run a daily build, you need to have that like CI/CD set up. So you wanted to make sure, like in the future, when you grow the team, people will know where to get the build, and they need to follow a certain process so they don't break the build, they don't cause troubles to others, and like certain guidelines need to be followed. And also like the asset creation part is similar, like coding standard and art asset creation, and we have all the standard like set up that you need to follow that. It's not taking a lot of your time, and it's probably just like you need some time to read that, and you just when you work on your stuff, make sure like you stick with that. That's it. But if you don't do that in the early stage, you're gonna find it very, very hard in the future to kind of optimize that. And that's like always the number one thing I talk to the team. Even the team size is small and very early stage, because if you don't keep re-emphasize these kind of things, people tend to go wild. They always think like, oh, I need to get this done really quick. I have so many ideas. I want to iterate on that. And because they don't care much about the future. So people tend to focus on what they are seeing. Like even when you play a game, right? When we do game design, we want to always provide the shortest feedback to the player. So they immediately get excited and they keep playing the game. It's same, right? You need to, but it's professional development, and you need to emphasize that. Like you need to think a little bit ahead. You don't always focus on what you are seeing right now. So yeah, that's what I wanted. So I think the most important thing for process.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe just for the audience, I can kind of give my own views in terms of game development phases and the way we do things at our game studio, which is that for us, like we view pre-production as really about the elimination of key risks. So if we have a game design and we have a game that we want to make, what are all the key risks or the top 3, 4, 5 things that can kill this game? Is it the control scheme? Is it a monetization mechanic? Is it a specific kind of feature? And then we try to build prototypes in pre-production against those key risks. And then for us, after that, alpha for us is more about the core loop and the key features, like building those out and seeing if those work or not. Beta is around like developing, at least an initial layer of content. Soft launch then is about filling out all the content and about proving unitary economics. So on a per player basis, can we make money? And then a hard launch is scaling the project and making sure that we can, fulfill the economics on a project basis. So that's kind of how we view it. But Noemi, I thought it's interesting how you guys are trying to go live as soon as possible and having the dual tracks in terms of development. One additional thing that we are trying to do right now is to, we're still pretty early in development, but we are trying to set up like a very tiny additional prototype team so that not only do we have pre-production and trying to gain a better characterization or understanding of key risks in pre-production, but then also having like a monthly prototype team, which might be just like 2 or 3 people, where we continuously start think about risks for the game, and then every month build like a small prototype. We're trying to build that out right now as well.
It's really interesting, and I think like when you describe all your phases, I think also like the goal when you go live super early is quite different, right? We're not gonna look at monetization KPI, for example, and stuff like that. But there's still like it's more gameplay focused and like fun focused and retention and seeing things like that.
Yeah.
But and it's a great place to prototype as well because it's lower risk. If you send something that, after all, it didn't work as well as we intended, maybe, or like we tried something. I know on Rainbow we had the test server, which remind me a little bit of this in the philosophy behind it.
Yeah,
where we would send early features.
Right. I do think it's very interesting though, because the Ubisoft approach versus the approach my studio takes, like if you think about it strategically, like the way that those two approaches are developed, you actually have to have a different set of expertise, right? So like, because the way that you guys are going, you're probably going to want to be more data oriented, having facilities to do multivariate testing, being able to get that feedback from your players. And so you need that infrastructure and you've got more of a data orientation. Whereas with us, we're a little bit more internally driven, right? More intuition focused. We believe that here's a risk. And for us, because we're not getting data from the public, we're building prototypes that we are intuitively, through our own intuition, are trying to make judgment calls on, for example. And now there's some things we're going to run tests on, but by and large, it's going to be more intuition driven. So I thought that's kind of interesting, these two different approaches.
Yeah.
That does. I was just going to jump in to say that reminds me of when you talk about collecting feedback from players and how you're trying to iterate as a team, there's always that challenge of, do you let every point of feedback, redirect the team's priorities and change everything, or do you have to kind of stick to your intuition or kind of the direction you've set? And just like the rest of this activity, it is very much one of balance and trying to find that right thing. But there's a couple key, I guess, bits of advice I've received over the years that have been really helpful. And one of those is, if you know the problems your team is facing, when you talk about addressing these key risks, if you already have a clear picture of, well, this thing doesn't yet look the way we think it needs to, or, it has these essential characteristics, it's okay to wait on feedback, at least for some time. It's kind of like, don't have somebody revise an essay you're writing if you haven't done your own revision pass and taking care of the easy stuff that you already know. So, just as with everything, you're trying to strike that balance, but it is okay to kind of, another one is like if you're doing player labs or you're doing internal testing, if 3 testers have already tripped over one bug or one problem or one friction point, you don't need the other 5 testers or 10 to go through that same experience. So you can say, hey, we have already got this, and then help them along. So there's a lot of theory around how you run, tests and labs. And generally you want to stand back and let the player experience what you've created without interfering. But at the same time, once you've gotten the feedback, you don't need to kind of continue receiving it. So I think that as you talk about collecting input from players, it's okay to say, well, we've gotten that feedback, we understand this, or hey, we already know about this problem, so we don't want our players to have to suffer through these friction points that we already know about. So that's definitely an area that I think it is good to trust the team and kind of embrace what you know.
I think you make a strong point, right, in terms of how do you use the data, right? That you do have to have a balance, both intuition as well as taking what the data is telling you. So that's definitely something that is both sort of art and science, and kind of the hard part about making games.
Yeah, and there's I think that's a whole other probably recording, but there's a big team management component to it as well. I think as soon as you're a live game or have live part, because the devs are going to read the forum, and how do you manage that, right? Like you said, Chris, so not every comment is treated as like something you need to act upon right now. But that's a whole other discussion.
Okay. And maybe moving to the next topic, I know we're kind of getting short on time here, but definitely for me, these are all super interesting topics. But the next topic to think about, I wanted to discuss key engineering processes that a development team should have. Now, whether it's, code review, Xiang, you mentioned a daily build process. I don't know if you're using Jenkins or Cloud Build or however you're doing it, but in terms of more on the engineering side, actually. So on the engineering side, whether it's CI, code review, things like that, what are important engineering practices? And Noemi, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that from an engineering perspective, but maybe we start with you.
Probably not as much,
okay.
Because I am not a tech person.
Mm-hmm.
But I used to be a closer, which is the person who arrive at the end to make sure everything's wrapped up and we can ship it. And code reviews for me are a must.
Okay.
Always.
Chris?
I guess I'll just quickly say 2 parts that are, I think, really important. The first is you have to be able to run your game. And I know that sounds obvious, but when teams go too deep on when they have, an 18 different branches and different copies and clones, and you've got at the end of the day, you're shipping one video game, which means all the code, all the art, all the assets have to be combined. And I think getting the team to practice building the product and running it every day, or whatever that cadence is, but as frequently as you possibly can, is essential. And, I'll confess that early on with Pragma, even though we're only doing, the back end part of video game development, we kind of skipped a couple steps on getting some of those CI systems and those build systems set up because we were working closely with a game partner. So we just kind of leaned on that. But quickly we ran into all the friction that is hey, but if we can't take it end to end on our side, it's hard for us to know whether it works or not. And even though it sounds obvious, it's really important. And so I would just say that really, and it gets into the CI and CD part, but it also gets into how you manage the code base. And if you let people, different parts of the team work for months at a time separate and try to glue it all back together, you're going to find that you're going to end up paying more cost in integration than if you help the team practice integrating frequently. And again, if you're only shipping a single game product, then, you only get value when all the code and all of it's packaged together and you can play your game. So.
All right, what about you, Xiang? So it sounds like CI seems to be something that that both of you guys agree is relatively important.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, right. Because right now I'm in a relatively large company because we have many teams. So one advantage we have is we have the luxury to have a central tech team, and they can focus on certain stuff. Because we have, for example, central backend, central platform, central client. A central graphic. So they will be able to deliver certain packages. And for example, the CI/CD system, we are building that with our central backend team. So they it's not just for the daily integration, it's also for game publishing. So the entire thing is integrated into that. So we're still working on that. It's not really there, but the blueprint is pretty beautiful. So I wanted to brag a little bit about that. So because ultimately, when you are developing, you wanted to simulate as much as possible with the live environment, things like that, because you don't want to build something that you tested fine locally. When you ship that to the live environment, there's all kinds of different weird issues. So since for example, we're using a Docker and Kubernetes to do the entire CI/CD and publishing. And it works very well with the local testing because the local test environment is going to be very similar to the live environment. So our central QA team will be able to intervene and test and spawn their own servers and do the test by themselves without even asking the game team to set up server for them or the ops team to set up the live environment for them, because they're going to be able to spawn this similar environment and doing the test. So I would say a smaller team usually don't have the opportunity to do that because it's really time consuming. You could spend like several man months to just get one bit of stuff done. So smaller team, I would encourage them to really just focus on leverage those open source solutions like Jenkins or TeamCity, and help them to build the pipeline and follow the best practices other people already show them, right? Because the easiest thing is to copy, right? It's like you just need to copy that and tailor a little bit to your team, because different teams always have their own situations. You can't do a perfect copy because otherwise we're not here to discuss about process, right? It's always some kind of specific issues. You are, for example, your team could be too large, your team could be too small, and you have like missing key persons, things like that, and you just want to tailor the process and the tools for your team. And I think that should work in general. But yeah, CI is something I think is pretty important. I'm not a big fan of code review. I think large team or the game is already on is live ops, large game in live ops. They probably want to do code review. When I was at EA working on Madden, it's a console game, old days that when you ship the disc, you won't be able to do any patch, right? Unlike today, I was always kidding, like a programmer get lazy and lazier because they always can fix their stuff in certain ways. I mean, in old days, there's no way when you ship, we call that gold, right? We celebrate that. I mean, people take 1 day off to gold. Because after that, you really don't have anything to do, right? You literally just can't work on anything. So people tend to be very strict about the code quality, and so that's why it's very important to do code review in those kind of circumstances. And similarly, for a large game, it's already live ops, you want to make sure your update doesn't break the game, and it's very important. I would encourage code reviewing for that type of thing. But for the early game development, prototyping, even like early development, even massive development for a new game, I don't think it's important. It's up to you. I mean, certain teams, they feel like quality is the key. Go ahead with that. But I'm just not that type of person. I think efficiency is more important.
But would you also think that it also has to do with situational context as well, right? So if you have like a small team of super veteran programmers, code review, a little less important. But if you have a mixed team with some junior people who need to also learn, then maybe you also do code review. And then you could also just think about, what parts, like there's this critical part of code, your net code or your whatever, right? Like maybe you want to code review that part, your UI, your other code. It's just like whatever.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I was very generic. It's definitely going to be case by case. For example, if you're a new hire join the company for just 1 month, you want to make sure And at least you use code review to review this person, right? You think this person is culturally fit with your engineering team or not. I mean, this is the easiest way to check that. Second, you don't want that person to break the build. So that's definitely important. And certain core system, you do want to make sure it's not like some certain bug going to be hide over there. I agree with you. It's always case by case.
Yeah. So just to talk a little bit, like we have an interesting group in terms of having a lot of experience on the team, but you'll find with a lot of companies, you'll hear things like, well, let's make sure that we don't have single points of failure, right? So you want some, more than one person to know an area. But I'd say the most natural outcome is that you're going to end up having one expert that owns one area of your system. So, our group has gone pretty deep down the kind of extreme programming, like very formal kind of agile processes where we practice test-driven development and pair programming. I would say that that's not a common approach, but the areas that I've seen that be really successful are it naturally addresses some of those questions about single points of failure. It naturally builds the code review into the process of having people work on it. There's definitely the production tension of like, hey, are we working fast enough or not? But one of those areas that I guess we've leaned on in particular, and some of this emphasis is on back-end development. When you're running a 3D physics engine and doing simulation, doing very controlled automated tests can be a lot more difficult. So there's different tools for different jobs. But one area we've seen, though, is that by reducing defects and shipping fewer bugs, we definitely have seen an uplift in long-term efficiency. So, we had different product teams throughout Riot, for example, and some of those teams, if they had issues with quality, in a few circumstances, we had teams saying things like, well, we're spending 50% of our time on live support and dealing with problems, and so you say, well, half of the team's effort is now spent on solving the problems of the things that were built before. Whereas for a couple teams that I worked with, we were able to maintain that quality bar such that in general it was less than a 10% drag. It was something like, hey, we might have 2 or 3 incidents a year. This is in the context of a live service game. So there is something, I guess there is a case to be made for quality, which says if the team is not having to constantly go back to previously shipped features and fix and repair things, then you can kind of have that steady progression of like, hey, we can always build and ship new features, which is great. But it is going to be dependent upon which area of the code base you're in. And there's definitely areas for which some of these patterns are a lot more difficult, like in the middle of a game engine.
And Chris, when you think about whether it's like a lead-driven code review process versus peer-based versus, I guess, what you're doing now with pair programming, can you speak to like when you think one is more appropriate versus another or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think they'll all have benefits. I mean, just getting feedback on things like names and structure is going to just improve the quality of the code because it makes it easier for the next person to come in and read it. So even peer reviews can be really valuable. I definitely agree that reviewing new folks or less experienced folks can be a benefit just because it gives them a teaching feedback loop, which I think has a lot of value. One area that we're actively trying to explore and discuss is about those coding standards, which is like, sometimes you'll get in arguments about formatting, and that's not something I care a huge amount about. But there's like a deeper level to that, which is like, how do we structure and organize things? How do we name things? And even though that sounds small, it does make a big difference for the team, especially when you get to a larger team size. It's like if we have a set of there's the folder structures, here are how things get named, here are how things work together, then you learn how one area of the system works, and then you can translate that. That helps you move your team around. Engineers can work on other groups' stuff. So I do think that there's a case to be made, and that should probably be lead-driven because I've yet to see a consensus-driven approach kind of that outcome.
Got it.
Yeah, I wanted to echo on that. That's exactly what I was talking about earlier. Like it's something small you need to do well in order to scale, and typically that's lead-driven because it's just like because there's no best or bad, like no good or bad. It's just like one standard everyone follows. That's it. In the future, like everyone on the same page, it's much easier for communication. There's no gap, so that's it.
Noemi, did you want to say something?
Yeah, my answer was way too it generalized too much. I'm sorry, because I spent the last 5 years on live games, so for sure that taints my lens of what we need. But also, do you feel like the bigger the team, the more review there should? Because it's fairly new that I'm on a smaller team. Back at Ubisoft, the teams are well known to be really big. So I wonder if it's colored our processes and our best practices, right, for code reviews, because you have a lot more dependencies if you have, I don't know, like hundreds of people working on the same branch, like 300, 400, 500 people working on the same branch every day.
Yeah, I mean, these guys are the CTOs, but I would assume the bigger the team, the more mix of junior versus senior and that kind of thing, I would assume that you'd have a higher requirement for code review and things like that. But in summary, sounds like the three sort of engineering processes we're talking about that are probably important to look at: CI, code review, and then having some type of coding standard is what it sounds like we're saying here, right? Okay, so maybe we could move to the final topic, which is essentially what should the development methodology, whether you're agile or waterfall, in terms of if you're sprint based, whether it's like a 2-week sprint versus 1 week, 3 weeks, things like that. Like maybe we could talk about that. And, it's kind of funny though, because I believe there was a study, it was called the Game Outcomes Study, that kind of showed that there was actually no difference between teams that, employed a waterfall methodology versus some form of agile methodology in terms of outcomes for games. But wondering what you guys think, or what your experiences are in terms of what you believe are best practices when it comes to agile, waterfall, your sprint structure, and how you've actually kind of, and then we can kind of dive into the sprint itself. And I know, Xiang, I've talked to you about this before as well in terms of how you structure it and all that kind of stuff. But Noemi, maybe we could start with you again and your thoughts in terms of like just this development practice and methodology.
Yeah, I have so many opinions on this, but I'll try to be concise. I think in a nutshell, what's the best practice is whatever is going to work for your team at any given moment, right? I think when we come up with our best practice for our team, it depends on people's style, on the teams you have. Like, is it a 5-people team? Is it a 20, 30, 400 people team? But I think what is key is to adapt it as well, right? I think proper agile works really well when you're in conception or pre-production, where you want to go fast, you want to iterate quickly, fail quickly if you have to as well. But once you get in a bigger team and your features take longer than one sprint, well, maybe that's when you need to move on to a more hybrid model of like some things are going to be more waterfall and some other are maybe more agile. I am not an agile evangelist, as you can see, but yeah, I think adapting your style to where you're at in the project, to the team type of team you have. I feel also if you have a really big team, it's very valuable to have different layer of methodology. So you give your team leads as well in your or your feature team if you have cross-functional teams. You give them liberty to organize their work in a way that you can follow as a producer, but also in a way that works for them on a day-to-day basis, right? And for sprint length specifically, that's a tough one, because I think, again, earlier you can have really short sprint and it works, but once you get in production, it gets more difficult to have work sometimes that is that you can break in small chunks, and then Jira becomes a mess if your work can't fit into like the exact length of your sprint. We're still exploring with that at the moment, actually, on our project. So we've just moved to 4-week sprints to see if that would work a little bit better, give a bit more time to the team, because we're entering a phase where we're building more the systems and the big structure and really focusing on stuff that we can't rush. So yeah, but we need to adapt. I think that's something, maybe it's just on the management side, but I think it's something we need to do more, and to ask yourself, why do we work this way? Especially, for example, if you're trying to follow Agile in game development, often you're going to have a lot of pain points if you're trying to follow it to the letter. And well, maybe it's not because how we make games doesn't work, but maybe it's just that those points of Agile are just don't fit with how your team work. And maybe there's another way to go about it that's going to be as efficient. Like you said, if the studies found that there's no difference. But yeah.
Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. There's a lot of books written on the subject, and it's funny because the origin of the agile methodology, and it was named such because it came from an engineering group, and what they said was, well, we want to learn how to move fast and change. And so the whole structure originally had been built to say, start with a certain set of practices, and then every week or every iteration, you should be evolving the process. But as soon as something gets a name, then it has a strict set of rules, and then people have this rigidity. And I think that's very natural. So I definitely subscribe to the lowercase agile idea that which is really what Noemi said, which is you need a process that works for your team. So if people are doing things that feel painful to them, that feel like they're wasting their time in meetings, that they feel like they cannot plan or execute in a way that feels good, then that's broken. I think that the goal is, at the end, you want to ship a product. And if it's a service-based game, you want to ship a product, once every couple of weeks or once every month. And so I guess it kind of goes back to some of the technical practices, but really getting the team practiced at, we need to be able to build and run our game and test it and play it. And that testing component really matters. So I guess I don't find myself very prescriptive on you have to use this formal practice. And frankly, I think any decent process that's consistent will be fine as long as you're paying attention to the pain points for the team. And one of the things I always try to measure is, does the team feel like our meeting time is a waste? I mean, every engineer, I think, or artist probably wants to be at their desk working. But I will say that when my teams have been doing the best, it felt like, oh, we're getting in a room to plan together, and everyone was involved. And then most of the time, when it's going badly, is people are on their phone, they're not paying attention. So I do think you want to tailor your process to the team, and if not, you should change it.
Xiang?
So yeah, I think one thing important for process is the expectation management. Why I mentioned that is there's a few good examples with myself what I have experienced. When I was running my own startup, Outact, initially it was our investor wanted to heavily involved in the game development. So basically, we ended up having a 2-week review. So we had to tailor our entire process to be a 2-week agile process that we are making demos for our shareholder. So that's quite disrupting. And after I think back, when doing post-mortem, I think because we used to blend the other side. We thought that they kind of want to micromanagement that. They want micromanagement, and it's always in my opinion, when we were discussing about that, it was one side issue. But later on, when I review this entire thing, it's two sides. It's not just one side. The thing is the expectation was not met. It's not properly managed. So the thing is you need to set a very good expectation during your development, because it's different, right? It's different cases, because there could be an external partner, it could be a publisher, it could be an investor, it could be just your team. Different team, they all always have expectations, and different people have the expectations. First of the thing, most important, you need to align that expectation, put everyone on the same page. And this is, in my opinion, the most important thing about all the process. You just make sure people knows what others are doing and what your team goes. And this is what in my opinion, is very important thing for Scrum or for any agile process, right? They are doing those Scrum meeting. They want to set a goal or something like that. And at the end of the Scrum meeting, and they review that. Then they break that into small chunks, so it's much easier for you to set goals. Because if the goal is too far away, people just fall apart. So this is important. If you can properly manage the expectation of all shareholders, and it could be the manager, it could be other employees, it could be your peers, it could be senior executives, and then your entire process will be much, much easier. And this is the biggest lesson I've learned from all my previous experience. And I've been always trying to tell our teams, like, don't be hesitate to communicate what you are trying to do with all your stakeholders. And because sometimes people try to present the best part or the prepared part to them. So particularly when they are making a demo, they try to wait until the last minute. I call that like artist effect. They don't want to show a half-baked work to any other people. They wanted to finish that before showing, but that's actually going to be a big issue in real life environment. Because if people don't see something, they're going to have all kind of guesses or wrong impressions. They are trying to think, oh, you didn't work well, or you are trying to you kind of was driving away from our original goal, things like that. So you keep communicating all these things to your shareholders, to your team, so everyone on the same page. Then any process could be much easier. So yeah, in my opinion, I don't worry about what kind of process you use. You just pick the one that you feel will work best for your team, and stick with the expectation management. And that's it.
Yeah, the way that I kind of think about this, and just kind of taking a step back with respect to whether it's agile or waterfall. Noemi, you mentioned that you're, to your point, it kind of depends on your team and situational context. But I kind of view it from the perspective of actually complexity domain, right? So like, if you know your target, if you know what you're going to be developing, and you don't expect a lot of iteration, then in my opinion, the obvious solution would be a waterfall methodology, because you know your target, you just need to execute against the target. And then I would say for agile, and to the point that you're making, Xiang, in terms of like expectations, and when it comes to like, you mentioned like a 4-week sprint. I think the length of the sprint, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, has to do with, to the point you were making, Xiang, about who the stakeholders are and what is a reviewable piece of code, or what in Agile, what's called PSPI, potentially shippable product increment. So what are you able to show in terms of a product increment? And so in games, I've typically seen something like more often 2 weeks or 3 weeks. In the web world, it's usually 1 week, because you're able to quickly show for a website or whatever, you can see things in a 1 week increment versus, in games, you generally need 2 weeks, 3 weeks. If you're some live ops teams are 4 weeks, for example, because that's how much time it takes to have something that is reviewable to stakeholders and things of that nature. But yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. And then in terms of like, maybe just kind of going into the weeds a little bit more, do you guys have any specific thoughts when it comes to, for example, the structure of the sprint, like having like that initial planning meeting? How do you guys come up with the tasks? Who does the task breakdowns in terms of costing stuff? And this is something that's usually religious. Is it based on t-shirt sizes, complexity, time? And I've gone through all of that stuff, but I don't know if any of you guys have any specific thoughts on the sprint structure itself. Anyone want to jump in on that?
All right, one thing I can mention is you keep seeing, particularly about engineer delaying, and it's kind of a norm in game development. And people would think that, all right, after several iterations, the estimation. You better estimate that, right? You learn the lessons, you need to spend, and you keep seeing delay, and people keep adjusting their estimation, and you keep delaying that. So, and people working very diligent, people like work day and night, and they still delay. So the reason we keep discussing about that, why that there are such kind of delaying, it's not about like people not learning, and people are learning, and they try to like give certain kind of buffers to any of the estimations, and they still get that. Is I think this one thing is like the biggest thing is like when you still going back to that expectation management is like when you set expectation and you try to do that like within your control. So how should I describe that? It's like say if there is a task assigned to engineer, and that engineer would say that, okay, I can do that in 2 days. That's my estimation. But let me give it another day as a buffer because I know there are going to be a lot of iterations, things like that. So the engineer gives that 3 days to the PM or producer, and it's recorded in Jira, for example, and start working on that. And then the engineers think, okay, I have 3 days to work on this thing. So the engineer is basically working on this task with 3 days in mind, not 2 days in mind. That's the biggest problem. Like basically they think they have control over 3 days. So they basically just scale this entire thing. For example, if it's a 2-day process, if it's a 2-day task, then something you probably will skip. You probably just like get a shortcut to certain thing. But you think with that 3 days in your mind, you think, oh, I'm going to do this in a perfect way. I'm going to restructure this code. I'm going to get there. And you end up spending 5 days on that. So that's always the biggest issue. I keep talking to our engineers, like when you estimate that for 2 days, you work on 2 days, you leave that 1 day buffer just as a buffer. You still think you should finish that in 2 days, not 3 days. So that's actually one big lesson I've learned, and I try to communicate to the teams. But unfortunately, it's not always working, and I want to keep mentioning that. I think that's going to be always a challenge to overcome.
Yeah. I'll just I think that effect is probably universal. I think everyone's experienced it. There's a couple really good books on the topic, and one is by a guy named Donald Reinertsen about product development flow. And he basically studies like the Toyota production system and that kind of Kanban ecosystem, but he really does a great job of saying, hey, this model is applicable to product development. However, all the tuning parameters, all the variables are actually like almost the opposite. In manufacturing, you're trying to literally produce an identical piece with the least amount of change, the most reliability. In product development, you know, software is, you know, you write a piece of code and then you can run it on 1 million computers. So every feature is by nature unique and new and interesting. That's why we're adding features to our games, to our products. And so what he describes is that inherently iteration and experimentation has to be part of that journey because you're trying to find something new. You're not trying to replicate the feature you wrote last week because that one's already written. And so what he tries to describe is that when you think in terms of estimation, it is not about a commitment to I will get my work done on exactly this scale in exactly 2 days. It's just too hard to predict the future, and nobody is very good at it. So he basically tries to describe like an estimate should be treated as like a bell curve, and it's like the middle point. So if you say 2 days, you should think of that in terms of, well, sometimes you actually are pleasantly surprised. Usually it doesn't happen, but sometimes you get your work done in half a day. More often you go long, but importantly, if you treat it as not a commitment of I will get this done in 2 days, and instead it's a bell curve or it's a distribution of median expected completion time, that makes it safe for people to give honest estimates. And it makes it so that they don't feel that they have to pad the estimates, because I think that the effect Xiang is describing is very common for people to want to add extra buffer time, and then they expand the ambition of their work, and then of course they run over. So I think that that's a key insight into estimation, that if you can make people feel safe that it's not a commitment, but it's an expected average completion time, then it makes, and if you plan around that, you have to build buffers into your schedule, not into your estimates. Because as soon as you start doing that, you stack a buffer into the estimate, buffer into the schedule, and now this is how things go, 2 times over, 4 times over.
Right. And I think that's a good point that, software tasks are inherently, it's not a perfect science. So estimation is always a little bit off. And so to that point, like, how do you guys recommend to do estimations? And like, Chris, you're saying it should just be an potential expectation, but not a commitment. Noemi, in the console world, I kind of feel like oftentimes it's considered a commitment, if I'm correct. And so, what do you guys recommend in terms of, like, if you have whoever's running the scrum, if people are running behind, what should the reaction be, or what should the attitude be? Is it like, oh, we're slipping again? Oh well, let's do better next time, guys. Or should it be like, guys, like maybe you could speak to what the reaction of a producer or a product manager should be with respect to estimations, and maybe what your experience has been. Noemi?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. I have allergies. It's awful. Yeah, I think by having like two level of planning, you also help with the slippage. For example, it was the same when I was in AAA, and it's the same on mobile. I plan a milestone in 3 months, and then in that milestone, we're going to plan all the sprints. But when I plan the milestone, I do work with estimates, which I add a buffer in time, because also, right, if someone tells you it's going to take me 3 days, it's still going to take 5 days, because they're not going to be able to work on it full time for 3 days usually. Like, especially us, we're a small team, so people work on many things at the same time, and we're live, so they can be called on doing live support as well, which usually takes precedence over what we're working on. So when we do plan the milestone, we plan buffer for live, but we also plan some work that can slip because it's not mandatory. So I think that has worked really well so far for us, because it means that people can work on other stuff that, like, no one is gonna come in and and be disappointed if it doesn't ship, because it was like a stretch goal or an initiative that we wanted to add, like something that's really nice and we do want to have it, but it's less time sensitive. So that's been working pretty well. And then into the sprint, we try to do the same thing as well. So people are, because we booked live support in every sprint as well, that can also act as a buffer if we don't need it. So that, like, ultimately it balances itself out pretty well over the long run. So of course we don't want to slip in sprint, but ultimately if we slip in sprint but the milestone is fine, we're still in a good position, right? Like, in the grand scheme of things, we're still gonna arrive at our gate or at our next team goal that we want to hit.
All right, guys. Any other thoughts on the estimation aspect? Do you guys also have any specific thoughts on, like, time versus complexity versus whatever?
I would say the formal models that I've looked at would suggest that every estimate by itself is wrong. And if you have a consistent measure, a consistent form of estimation, it becomes predictive in the long term, which means that in aggregate, they'll actually become reliable, even though literally every single individual one is wrong. And what's really valuable is to keep a consistent form of estimation. So to Xiang's point, if the team keeps adjusting how they're estimating every time, every cycle to try to account for it, then the model will never kind of like stabilize.
Okay. Well, you know what? I think we're kind of running out of time here. I actually have a bunch of additional things I wanted to talk about. This kind of topic is very interesting to me, but in the interest of time, maybe we could just wrap it up here. And maybe as the final message, do you guys have any message for our audience? Maybe starting with you, Noemi?
Sure. Well, we're hiring for sure. So if we have a lot of position open, if people are interested, they can look at Square Enix Montreal. And for me, like to wrap this up is really like to keep your production strategies adaptable and flexible. Okay, thank you.
Chris?
I would just say that this is a fascinating topic that I had fun talking about, and definitely encourage folks to dig into literature around the subject. And at Pragma, we're our team is growing, and we're focused on building backends to power online games. So I'd love to chat with folks.
All right, Xiang?
Yeah, I think ultimately making game is a fun thing to do, and it's quite different from other stuff. So what I would recommend is always follow your heart, create a fun environment, work with others, laughing all the day, and that's actually a pretty positive attitude, and they'll actually help you to improve your efficiency, and that's very important in my opinion. More important in the process, in my opinion. Maintain a very healthy environment.
Okay, got it. All right, well, thank you very much for your time, everybody. And I think that's it. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.